Welcome to the HITea with Grace podcast, where we spill the tea on HITea. I'm thrilled to be here at the ViVE conference with Laura Rogers, Senior Director of Healthcare Strategy at SHI International. Thanks for joining me today.
It's been a long road, a long, windy road. Originally, when I was back in college, I actually went to school for hospitality management, food and beverage. I had already had some leadership roles in restaurants and hotels and private country clubs and thought, hey, if I pay my dues here, I can end up at this gorgeous resort in Hawaii and work a few hours a day and mingle on the beach the rest of the time. I quickly found out that was not reality. And I was burned out literally within a year of leaving school. And so just to buy some time, I was hired by an IT reseller for quote unquote customer service, which I thought, hey, this is a temporary job, pay some bills for a little while and let me figure out what's next. What happened was that I all of a sudden was tossed into B2B tech sales, cold calling customers. Back in those days, we faxed our contact information out, and I panicked. What am I doing here? I never imagined myself to be a salesperson, but here I am. Fast forward maybe a year or so, and what I realized was that my penchant for planning and organizing and making orderly out of chaos actually fit with tech and with sales really well. And so I spent about 20 years in that role as a top seller working with healthcare organizations. And how I came to healthcare was really looking at this vast territory, huge product portfolio, just selling tech for tech. I wasn't getting it. I was making money, but I wasn't getting it. And so I just stumbled upon a few hospitals. This is back in early 2000s, and realized that helping one with one project made sense to me. And then I figured out the next hospital needs it, and the next and the next. And so I started that rinse and repeat. And now the tech was making more sense. There was an impact there, right? And so thinking about how when I went to my doctor's appointments, I saw a laptop. I figured out they had a cart and they were using wireless, and now it's real, right? So after the 20 years of being in that role, I decided, like Michael Jordan, to go out on top. Was at the top of my career. I had built this vast network. I had a lot of customers in healthcare, a lot of partners, a lot of alliances, and I liked that part of it, but needed to do something different. So ended up at Chime, actually, as a director of business development, and I was managing a lot of the big tech firms and some of the smaller niche healthcare IT firms. Was actually part of the Chime team that launched the first ViVE back in Miami.
There.
Yes. Back in 2022, a long time ago now, but it was so exciting to work with the health team and to see the back end operations that it takes to put on an event like this is really incredible. And so that was a place where I could hearken back to my hospitality management days. At the end of 2022, this opportunity at SHI popped up. Ty Lee, who is our CEO, founded the company in 1989. She had decided it was time to verticalize into healthcare. SHI was the last in our space by many years. And the thought of building from scratch, knowing I had all the parts and pieces and Ty's investment, it was too good to be true. And so I jumped at the opportunity. And so here we are. We're entering our third full year as a team. I'm managing 2 other women. My entire upline leadership is women.
Love it.
And for those of you that don't know, SHI is actually The largest minority woman-owned business in the country.
Wow.
As a $15 billion global IT.
That is incredible. I just absolutely am so excited to learn from you today and just glean from your experience in this. We're seeing a shift in care delivery models to meet patients where they are. I'm sure you're just so excited to see that given how long you've been in the space and see how technology has been upticking in the space. So what's driving this push to bring care into the home?
It's a great question. And I think where people start is often on the hospital side. It's cheaper for hospitals. They can free up bed space for the sickest patients, the most profitable patients. They can put their workforce out into the fields that maybe keeps some of those nurses on staff a little bit longer, gives them more flexibility. But where people forget is that there's a patient here.
Yeah.
And we're all patients. None of us want to sleep in a hospital bed. We don't want to eat that food. We don't want nurses coming in all hours of the night. Where we want to be is at home with our friends and our family and our dogs and our cats and our living room and TV and all that. And so I think that's a place where we need to shine the spotlight more is on the patient side. The win for both sides, but let's think about it from the patient perspective.
So interesting because every survey of healthcare consumers says we want to do this at home, right? We want to have the ability to do this from home. And the industry is saying we want to do this from home, right? So we hear about cybersecurity risks or things of that nature. As we're moving patient care from these highly secure hospitals to maybe potentially less secure homes, what are some of the potential risks in the Care Anywhere model? And what's the industry doing to really protect that patient data in the process to make sure that maybe that isn't really the challenge the industry or some people might think it might be?
That's a great question. When I think about Care Anywhere, there's three main focuses that I see in that group. The first is the clinical mobility, the devices for the nurses, the collaboration tools, the telehealth, the network connectivity that enables all of that to happen. The next piece is really around the application and the infrastructure. How are these nurses doing charting, looking up patient information? What's the performance and the reliability of that infrastructure so that when they're in a patient home, they can still get access to the information they need? And then the third is cyber that you mentioned. We can't look at cyber in a silo. It has to be considered at every layer, at every stage. And when we think about the risk and the opportunity for risk, it increases exponentially when now all of a sudden we don't have just a hospital network anymore. The network edge is limitless. And leaving a device in a patient home is a risk. Putting up a 5G access point in a parking lot in a rural town is a risk. So I think it's really important for providers to be aware that their risk is going up and then really starting to build around that and leaning into their governance policies.
It's so interesting to think about. And I think you're right. If you're creating it at the genomic level, right? If you're developing it into everything that you're creating, of course it would be more secure, right? Versus just waiting for an attack to happen and then oops. And so folks really need to be thinking about this. Hospitals aren't the only places that need robust IT infrastructure in place anymore. How do we build a tech foundation that supports care at home in rural clinics and in everywhere in between?
Yeah, it's interesting because the patients are many times now being met where they are from the provider side. And so we think about the patient home, but we also think about a tent in a parking lot after a natural disaster. Care is happening there, right? The real challenge is how to get the technology deployed in a way that the providers will actually lean into it and use it for what it's worth. There's a few issues. There's budget. We know budget is always part of the conversation, but we also think about the bandwidth and the management that it takes to stand up any of these applications and new device rollouts, right? I saw a study that was done by Gartner last year of healthcare CIOs, and what they found was that 66% of CIOs said they don't feel that they are moving the needle with their workforce in making them more productive and more efficient. 66%. Another 30% said they don't feel confident architecting these solutions.
Man.
That's a problem.
Yeah.
That's a big problem. It's a huge opportunity for SHI, of course, but when I hear that, I think, how is any provider going to spend money on technology if they're not proving? And so I think about the way that the entire industry has to work together to create the governance and the policies, but then really show ROI and show a positive impact.
And it's interesting at SHI trying to figure out how to incorporate those understandings into your offerings, just knowing exactly where do they need that help to make sure that they have the support they need to be able to implement the solutions.
Yeah, and when I sat back and looked at how SHI is aligned to the market and how we can align, I always go back to the quintuple aim. Now, obviously, we didn't create the quintuple aim. That's a known industry framework that's evolved over time. But when I think about reducing costs, improving clinician satisfaction, and improving the patient experience, improving population health, and the equity around all of this, we believe that we can really make a difference in all of those areas. And just a teeny little piece moves the needle everywhere.
Yeah.
And so that's where our North Star is. That's where we're always thinking about when we're talking to our customers and providers. How do we help in one of those 5 areas?
Absolutely. We hear home is where the heart is, home is where the care is. So, but who's paying for it? That's the question. So reimbursements, talk reimbursement. The models haven't really caught up with delivering hospital level care at the home yet. So what's it going to take to get the payers on board with covering more care outside the 4 walls of a hospital? And how do we make sure that providers really get paid for the value that this model brings?
We know with payers, it's all about the dollars, right? So making some data trends that show that it is a cost savings is really going to be critical for the payers. Johns Hopkins has published some studies that they've shown significant cost savings. And so how do we scale that across the entire country, right? They talk about reducing costs. From a policy perspective, the current CMS waiver is set to expire on March 31st, 2025. That authorizes providers not only to provide hospital at home, but also to Medicare patients, who in many cases are the ones that will benefit the most from hospital at home. I don't think anyone is betting on the current administration, which way they'll go on that. There's just so many unknowns right now. So we're going to find out in about 45 days.
It's so interesting. It's like the healthcare consumers, the patients, the caregivers, the care partners are all saying, we want this, or they're screaming it from the rooftop. Providers are saying, we don't have enough support. We want this. It's helping us balance our workload. So we want this. And it just seems like CMS needs to be that third partner just saying, absolutely, this is it. And here we go. This is what care is going to look like from now on. So we'll see how this progresses. But I'm very excited that you guys are at the forefront of really putting it out there. So there are viable options that prove cost savings for people to choose from. Incredible. Women are often managing their own health alongside caregiving for loved ones. How can these care anywhere models help ease that burden and create more accessible, equitable healthcare experiences for them?
It's a great question. I think about just even my own health, right? I'm dealing with caregiving for my older parents. My husband has some chronic issues. And where do I stack in there? How do I make time for myself? Because if I ignore myself, everything else crumbles. And so prioritizing any of our own personal health and wellness is really critical. But I think about, actually, there's a book by Daniel Dawes called Political Determinants of Health. It's a fascinating read in the fact that it goes back over policy well over 100 years. And we look at women and underserved communities and underserved people. The deck has been stacked against them for decades. And the cycle keeps continuing, right? So I think about how do we break that cycle? And for the mom that's trying to juggle a job, a career, kids, family, all of these things, she can't take time off of work.
Oh, yeah.
The food doesn't get put on the table. So when her health is crumbling, what can she do? I think about the ability for telehealth on her lunch break, what a difference that could make. And for many people, that is reality today. But for a whole lot more, it is not anywhere close to current environment. So how do, if we could get devices to those folks, if we could get reliable internet to those folks, that makes a difference. It's not a prescription drug. It's not a surgery. It's these other components that factor into overall wellness.
Absolutely. And so inspiring to think that access will be just more available for women, no matter what stage of life they're in. From home, it's pretty incredible to think about the fact that could be a reality today, tomorrow, and then the next 5 years, that they will always have access at their fingertips, right in their pocket. Pretty incredible. So what's the coolest thing you've seen in the Care Anywhere space, whether it's clinical, mobility devices, predictive analytics, clinical biomarkers, remote patient monitoring? I mean, there's so many things, AI-powered solutions, can't forget AI. What's giving you hope that we can really make this thing happen?
It's a great question. For me personally, my shiny penny of the moment is the new continuous glucose monitors that are out. You don't have to have a diabetes diagnosis to get them. They're available over the counter. And I think about the influx of data that I can get on my own self that my doctor doesn't have. They're not tracking me daily. At least I don't think they are. So, just thinking about that from a personal standpoint is important and exciting to me. But then I also think about really using the products, the solutions that these providers already have. I mentioned that CIOs are not confident in making their projects effective. So the last thing that we need to do is shower them with new product. We need to figure out how to get them to use efficiently the product that they've got, right? And so in talking with CIOs, it's often, I find that the barriers to adoption are really around the budget, of course, but really just culture and change management and getting buy-in and telling that story of why the tech is important. And I think it starts at the very highest levels with the CEOs and the boards, how they perceive technology in their organization. It should be looked at as a competitive differentiator. But everyone in that health system needs to understand that and be bought into it. And if you leave one person behind, there's your ineffective project.
It seems like it's not just the right thing to do. It's a financially viable and important thing to do. This is what's going to keep your business afloat and alive and keep your employees happy and keep your patients healthy.
Exactly.
Right? So tell me, are there any habits that you have in your personal life that just keep you going to help you work your best and make a difference?
Just in the last few months, I've actually started a few new habits. One of them, and this is probably not new for many other folks, but I've started getting into the New York Times games and doing Wordle.
Dude, I love it. It keeps my brain sharp.
It really does. And I start my day with those and the LinkedIn puzzles too. And it's interesting because I've noticed my brain changing over time, that I can get through them faster and I know some of the tips and tricks. I've also noticed that I do them first thing in the morning. If I forget or don't have time, I'll do them later in the day, and I'm not as good at them. So that's really interesting for me. I've also started reading first thing in the morning. I find that I can't do it later at night. My headspace is just not there. I'm tired and worn down. So if I start my day with 20 pages of, could be fiction, it could be self-help book, whatever it is, I look forward to it every morning.
It's such a restful way to start your day versus hectic. It's, I'm going to do something that's good for me, that I know is going to be helpful for me. I love that concept. What are some strategies that you have utilized to help get through those obstacles?
I remember going way back to high school, a teacher walked in on the first day and he said, just so you all know, no one gets an A in my class. I prioritized that class over everything else for that entire year, studied harder, did more for the assignments, and I got an A.
Wow.
And I've really carried that forward with me over my career, that extra preparation and putting the time in, it pays off. Your competitor, the person on the other side of whichever fence, is just not doing that, and you can really set yourself apart.
So important. It's so interesting because somebody else today said that.
Interesting.
Which I think is really interesting. They were saying you got to put the effort in. You got to put the elbow grease in. And you got to have grit. Very fascinating.
I love the word grit.
I can tell. It definitely defines you. If you could give advice to your younger self, what would that advice?
I think a little bit of patience would have probably suited me in some scenarios back in the day. I think that's another thing that I see my brain growing and getting better at over the years. I also think that just letting go a little bit. I'm a planner, I'm an organizer. We did Emergenetics not too long ago, and my preference is structural.
And you're great at it.
Thank you. But I recognize the other spaces, the more creative, the more artistic, the more go with the flow kind of folks. And while I don't think I'll ever get there, I think that leaning into that, the older I get, is again stretching my brain. And I like that.
I love it. Thank you so much for joining us. To finish this conversation off, where can our listeners find you online?
Laura_Rogers at SHI.com or LinkedIn. I am on there as well. So I hope that I hear from some of your listeners. This has been fantastic. I'm so happy to be here today.
And I'm so happy you joined us. Thanks for being so generous with your insights. Loved learning from you, and you really inspired me today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
And thanks to you folks for joining us too. Check out the HITea with Grace podcast for more interviews with great guests like Laura today. Cheers.
Like a Girl Media is more than a media network. It's a community. We want to meet you and amplify your voice and the voices of outstanding women innovating in healthcare. Interested in starting your own podcast or hosting an event near you? Connect with us online or in person. We're here to support and empower you.